Considered by many to be a limitless source of food, more than 85% of the world's fish stocks are now being pushed to their limits. Are we consuming fish to the brink of collapse? This is Inside Story. Good to have you with us. Warm welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. Almost three-quarters of the planet's covered by ocean. Some say two-thirds, but we've all heard the figure's a massive amount, and it contains some 80% of all life on Earth. There is growing concern now that more and more of our marine life's in danger from overfishing in particular. Here are some figures from the World Wildlife Fund. More than 85% of the world's fisheries have been pushed to or beyond their biological limits. The WWF says current rules and regulations aren't strong enough to limit fishing to a sustainable level. And because of this lack of oversight and what it calls the open access nature of the high seas, there's just too much of them, there's little incentive for fishermen to leave the fish in the water. Now, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has carried out a major assessment of Europe's marine life on what it calls its red list. It found that 40% of Europe's sharks, rays and the lesser-known chimera have been overfished, or at least are threatened by overfishing. And it says that some of Europe's most popular fish, the Atlantic salmon, halibut and trout, have been overfished to the point of vulnerability. More alarmingly, it warns that 7.5% of Europe's 1,200 or so marine species face extinction. Not all bad news. Stocks of Atlantic cod and bluefin tuna, for example, have actually gone up, due in part, it's thought, to catch limits imposed in recent years. We are going to talk about those specific instances and a great deal more with our guests. It's being talked about, Sharp Focus World Oceans Day being marked this week, so let's bring them in. Let's introduce them all in London. John Tanzer, Director of WWF's Global Marine Programme. From Brussels, Maria José Cornax, Fisheries Campaign Manager for Oceana. And in Madrid, Rainer Fröser, Senior Scientist at the GMR Helmholtz Centre for Ocean Research. Rainer Fröser, let me start with you first of all. I mentioned the fact that Atlantic cod, Atlantic bluefin tuna, the stocks doing OK at the moment, in some cases increasing, but halibut, Atlantic salmon, turbot all going down. Why do conservation methods succeed in some cases but not in others?
Well, it depends how much the catches have been reduced. So for some cod stocks we are doing okay, but for example for the North Sea cod we are not doing okay at all, because we're still this year fishing it at twice maximum level that it can sustain. So while for several stocks we have reduced fishing pressure enough, for others we still have to do that.
But I'm just wondering why in particular with the Atlantic cod and tuna things are looking better than it is for the halibut, salmon and turbot.
It has a bit to do with how they are caught. Some of them are caught in big nets that catch many different species, and that makes it difficult to enforce reduced catches for some of the mix. So others are targeted specifically, and so it's easier to regulate just this one species. That might be one of the causes. But it also has to do with value. For those that are highly valuable, obviously, shall I say, people that have interest in catching them are reluctant to reduce the catches for a while. Because after 2-3 years, reducing catches, you can get back to where you were, and then you can actually get more than you have now.
And we will get on to the rules and regulations and enforcement in just a moment. Let's bring in Maria Cornax in Brussels. You talk about seafood fraud. You say it's extensive throughout Europe. Does that tie in with what Rainer is saying, or something else entirely?
Well, basically, we have to link or explore the links between why seafood fraud exists and what is the stock status that we have currently in Europe. We have to realize that due to the overfishing status of most of the European Union stocks, European Union has become an importing country. We consume mostly imported fish from everywhere in the world, basically. So consumers are not realizing actually about the worrying status of our stocks, and therefore are not noticing or are more vulnerable to seafood fraud, which is basically substituting one species for another, looking alike. This also implies some dangers in terms of laundering illegal catches from other fleets, or also implies massive fraud at economic level, because we are paying for something that possibly is much cheaper than the product we are thinking we are purchasing.
John, I'm sorry to butt in, Maria, but I want to come into to John Tanzer from the WWF on this one. Tied in with what Maria has been saying, I want to bring in an organisation called Blackfish. It says we need to concentrate much more now on the crime element in this. He says it is organised crime and corruption in the fishing industry. It's dire. It's about time we treated illegal fishing for what it really is, and that is something criminal. John, how do you go about doing that?
Well, we have a program that has a number of tools in the toolbox, if you like. I mean, we're working with the major buying companies on their traceability of seafood. We also have mechanisms for being able to track fishing vessels and report on where those fishing vessels are. And of course, we're working with governments about their enforcement levels. So it's not any single factor. It's a range of factors, and you know, you have to be vigilant on it. I mean, certainly there's an element of hard-edged organised crime. There's big dollars involved, so we need a sophisticated response to be able to deal with that.
So what do you think of the suggestion that 40% of the world's fish stocks are controlled by just 13 large companies, that this is such a big international conglomerate organised by just a few small companies that it's going to be almost impossible to stop them?
I understand the point that people are making with that, and that would be very much focused on the trade that's coming into the US and coming into Europe. But there's a large amount of fishing out there that is not about large industrial fishing. There's a large amount of fishing that is actually small-scale fishers, particularly in the south and east and the developing world, where there's many hundreds of thousands of small-scale fishers and artisanal fishermen who every day are dependent on what they catch and what they can sell locally. So it's a bit of an oversimplification just to look at it in terms of what's coming into the developed markets in the north and the west.
Actually, John, there was something, the artisanal fishermen, something I wanted to bring up in just a moment off the coast of West Africa in particular, as we take a look at it from this point of view, the political element to all of this, and getting any countries to agree on any kind of common policy is almost impossible. There's a territorial dimension to this too, with the potential that brings for illegal fishing. Here's an example. Somali fishermen say they were driven to piracy in some cases because they were forced out of their own waters by ships from China, Iran and South Korea, and territorial tensions in the South China Sea, home to rich fishing grounds there, strained relations between China and Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan and Malaysia, to mention just a few. Rainer Fröser, John Tanzer was mentioning there the fact that there are an awful lot of small fishermen in Senegal, I think it's 21,000 or something like that, who bring in pretty much all the fish that Senegal needs, but the waters there are becoming emptied because of commercial fishing. How do you deal with this when it's in the interests of some people running those governments to actually bring in the big ships, the big money, and take the trade-offs, the backhanders, the kickbacks that brings with it?
Well, basically, it's the countries decide who they give licenses to. That's the one issue. And they give more license to their fish stocks than they have fish. So that's one problem. But at least they get paid for that. But on top of that, they have illegal fishing in their waters, which they can't control because they just lack the means. They have no control boats to go out and chase them out of their economic zones. So it's a dual problem. But part of it is also that they sell their stocks several times, when actually they should also only sell that part of the stock that is still accessible, not used by their own fishers. So yes, the countries themselves are partly to blame. It's often the finance minister who is under pressure to bring in money, and selling license to fishing in their waters is one way he has, one of the few. And the money actually often goes back then to the rich countries which provided loans to them in the past. Yeah. So who is losing in all of this? It's the local fishers,
it's the local fishermen,
they have nothing to catch.
And you imagine also the fish themselves,
yes,
because they're getting pulled out of the ocean to depletion. Maria, why is there no major international enforceable agreement to prevent overfishing when we've known about this for 60, 70 years?
Well, there is actually a number of bodies called regional fisheries management organizations, which are created specifically to manage fish stocks to their sustainable levels, and also to ensure somehow that these management plans are respected. You mentioned
but enforceable, does it work?
Well, enforcement is, as you mentioned, as Rainer Kruse already mentioned, is a matter of willingness and capacity of coastal states. This from one side. On the other side is the commitment and also the commitment for sustainability from investing countries, let's say. In the European Union, you can imagine that we have major investments in fishing companies, as Korea does, for instance, in third countries. And I have to point out that, for example, in order to ensure enforcement at all levels in the European Union, we have a rule, a law, that obliges that apply penalties to all EU citizens that are involved in illegal fishing.
But, you know, unless things have changed, Maria, ever since I've been working on this story, which must be 25, 30 years, there have been many agreements, and they're unenforceable because the seas are so vast and fishing patrols in some countries hardly exist at all, while in other European countries there are too many of them, etc., etc. It doesn't work. Why isn't there something that's being pulled together on a multinational level that works?
Basically because we have one thing which is called the national sovereignty. So the main tool and what is changing currently the landscape, and I truly believe what I'm saying on this respect, is basically that markets are getting active in the fight against IUU fishing. When you close markets to IUU fishing or illegal fishing, when you close markets and ports, to vessels that are IUU fishing vessels, then there is no economic benefit of any illegal activity. So you have immediate enforcement, at least at the most basic levels, and you take a step forward.
I sort of get this argument because I've read it in a number of different places. And John Tanzer, I want you to agree or disagree with the sentiment I've picked up somewhere, that the argument about this now should be more about money than it is about morals. Say it affects people's livelihoods if there are no more fish in the sea, that it affects what they eat, that it affects countries' economies, etc. Don't tell them it's just bad to take all these fish out. It's got to be about money rather than morals.
Well, I think we have to know what we're losing. I mean, we have to know what we've lost and what we continue to lose, and we need to know what the implications are for people. I think the issues haven't changed, as you point out, David. It's been the same for a long time, but we're actually getting much closer to the edge, so to speak, for many of our fisheries, and particularly for those people who are unable to compete in the game, if you like. Those small-scale fishers and many developing countries where they are most vulnerable to efforts at over-exploitation. But there's two things that are absolutely critical in this. One is political will. And we are starting to see, I think, a turnaround in that. I feel that there is a building of political will, and that's coming about because of greater transparency and understanding, yes, on the part of consumers, but also on the part of officials, that it's not so easy to simply preside over the decline without anyone calling time on it.
Rainer Kruse, I see you nodding during the course of what John's had to say. You got a particular point on that subject?
Yes, in a way, you have to empower these countries. And I was thinking about the fact if you take away the fishers then have boats but no fish. What do they take? Basically, they start then carrying people across the Mediterranean to Europe. So in a way, you take away the fish, but then the fishers and others follow to Europe because you have taken away their livelihood. So this is a very short-sighted policy that we are doing there. We should instead enable these countries to manage their fisheries properly and to sell us products rather than taking away their fish.
OK, Rainer, thanks very much. We're going to get back now to something that John Tanzer from WWF was talking about, and that is we've got to know what we are losing. Here are some facts. Less than 2% of the world's oceans have been declared marine protected areas. These rules help protect habitats such as coral reefs, and other than that is down to the conservation measures taken by individual countries. Here's a fantastic example, an amazing example. Our environment editor Nick Clark reported on a success story in Cuba.
You'll probably have heard that wherever you go in this extraordinary island nation, you'll see things that resonate from a long time gone. Travel 2.5 hours south of Havana and you'll come to an historic stretch of coast. The Bay of Pigs, rooted in Cuban identity as the scene of victory over US-backed mercenaries in 1961. But here too, another legacy of Cuba's history and years of isolation, pristine coral reef. Around the world, more than 50% of coral reefs have disappeared. It is a different story here in Cuban waters, where marine ecosystems have had the opportunity to thrive.
Cuba has engaged in an enormous program of environmental protection, world leading. So here in Cuba, they're protecting 25% of their waters in marine protected areas. And that compares to maybe about 9% currently in the United States and only 2% worldwide.
The lack of chemical fertilizers in agriculture has also meant there's very little toxic runoff into the ocean.
It's almost like a time machine, going back in time to see what these coral reef ecosystems used to look like. And that really gives me hope for the future.
The further out to sea you go, so the abundance of marine life grows.
I see this as a great opportunity at a very opportune moment in history to help Cuba leapfrog over all those mistakes the rest of us have made.
And right here is another pristine ecosystem, intact and clean and totally unpolluted. The Zapata wetlands are one of the most extensive areas of Caribbean biodiversity that remain. There are lagoons and vast areas of mangrove swamp. Its shallow waters act as a nursery of marine life. It's huge.
It's huge, and here we are just watching just a very small area. If you go there, you have kilometers on kilometers of the same environment. With a very shallow water, so it means that the seaweed receive plenty of solar energy. This is a very inaccessible area, so it's well protected in general.
The wealth and beauty of Cuba's natural environment is staggering. It is a huge source of potential revenue, especially from ecotourism. But the trick will be tapping its wealth without destroying its integrity. Nick Clark, Al Jazeera, the Bay of Pigs, Cuba.
Maria Cornax from Oceana for Europe. Nick mentioned in his report there that 25% of the waters around Cuba are marine protected. He then went on to say 9% in the United States, 2% worldwide. Is it realistic to expect many other countries to come as close to what Cuba is doing?
It is. Actually, we have in the European Union also a commitment to reach 10% of protection of our waters. And also this protection is not only gets through marine protected areas like closed areas per se with no activities permitted. There is a number of sustainable activities that can be compatible with conservation. And actually is the only way through getting healthy ecosystems and productive fish stocks. There is a lot of economic benefits that can arise from these marine protected areas, and is one of the key elements together with fisheries management, sustainable fisheries management, that can help us to restore and rebuild our oceans.
And John Tanza from WWF, one of the points you made, I picked up from one of the speeches you gave, is that for every dollar you believe that's invested in marine protected areas, there should be a return of at least $3 in benefits, livelihoods, fisheries, coastal protection. You've got to get that message across, really, haven't you?
You do have to get that message across, and we're certainly working on that as best we can, because the reality is that the amount of ocean that is protected is woefully inadequate. And as the Cuban story, I think, really shows that if you've got healthy habitat, you can have healthy fisheries. And we often disconnect the two. You can't disconnect the two, whether that healthy habitat is even in the open seas as a matter of the water quality in the water column. So healthy habitat is absolutely essential. Marine protected areas, a network of marine protected areas, particularly focused on protecting the nurseries of the seas, protecting those recruitment areas, I think is fundamental to our attempts to be able to rebuild fisheries. I'm a strong believer that we need to expand that network of protection in order to rebuild and support and sustain fisheries.
And what is it that the amount of economic value that comes out of the ocean, if you can put it that way, every year is more than $2.5 trillion US dollars, maybe even $3 trillion US dollars?
Yes, I mean, we've done some work on this with the Boston Consulting Group, who went into detail, and the reason I'm quite confident of mentioning that figure in terms of annual flows of $2.5+ trillion is because I know that that's an underestimate. It's a very conservative estimate that they use, simply because the data wasn't there for us to be able to take into account the benefits of seamounts in the open seas, for instance, or kelp beds. So it's based on very conservative analysis, but it shows that the ocean, a healthy ocean, is an enormous economic asset, but it also shows that if you read that study, that it's in decline. The asset base is degrading, and its capacity to continue to deliver the dividends that we all depend on is under threat as a result.
Maria, let me come back to you before I move on to Rainer one more time. We talk to you because you're an expert on what happens in Europe in particular. There's a common fisheries policy. Well, in fact, there have been, if not for decades, then certainly not for, well, beg your pardon, they certainly don't seem to be enforced very well. But you reckon the one that came in January of last year could be better in this regard? Because they've said, the EU countries, that they're going to end overfishing by 2015, 2020 at the latest. We're now in 2015. What evidence have you got that shows that they're listening?
Well, that progress has been made, definitely. There was an after and a before and an after the CFP adoption, definitely. We started to listen to scientific advice. We started to recover some stocks to maximum sustainable levels. As you mentioned, for example, the cases, positive ones, of cod, bluefin tuna, other species. But still, we are too far away from our target. We are too far away from this objective you mentioned of 2015, 2020, the latest. Still, there is a strong disregard of scientific advice by EU member states, by the countries that are composing the European Union. And we estimate this gap between 35 and 31%, which is quite significant, and we are in 2015, and we are substantially far away of recovering stocks, because current figures, the latest ones, are saying that Mediterranean fish stocks are 93% overfished, and Atlantic stocks are still 48% overfished.
And Rainer, I'm going to have to come to you for pretty much the final word on this. You say you're optimistic, but the trends are against you.
Well, the current trends are, but you see big bodies like the European community, they move very slowly. In Europe, we have something called the trilogue. So the European Parliament, the Council of the Ministers, and the Commission have to agree on something, and then it moves forward. And that's a very slow process. But I agree with Maria that I'm also disappointed that in 2015, which was a clear goal to reduce fishing pressure to sustainable levels, we have failed for half in the north and for 90% in the south, in the Mediterranean. So that is really not very encouraging. Now 2020 is supposed to be a hard target, no excuse anymore. But, well, we really have to reach that. And see, I did an analysis a few years ago, and it was called Reform Slips Through the Net. And that was before the reform was made, but sometimes I'm afraid it's happening now, because I was more optimistic about implementation than what's happening now. I'm surprised that basically those that are in charge, those that have made the laws, are not now obeying their own laws and skip over it. And most of all because it's stupid, sorry to use this word, because there could be higher catches, there could be more sustainable supply for Europe, and all you need is for 2-3 years, fish a little bit less, maybe a quarter less, maybe a third, maybe half less than now, and you get the same, and afterwards you get more than what you have now. So every other business knows that if you want more in the future, well, you have to invest now. Why not fisheries? I can't get that.
Okay. Thank you, every one of you. John Tanzer in London. We had Maria Jose Konax in Brussels and Rainer Fröser there in Madrid, each one of them far more fluent with the English language than I was at a couple of times during the course of that programme. But I do hope that you managed to enjoy and to understand certainly what they were saying. I hope what I was saying. Thank you for watching. As always, we would like to hear your thoughts. Our programme page, go there if you like, aljazeera.com, and you can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can tweet us too at AJ Inside Story. From me, David Foster, and the whole team here, goodbye for now. See you next time, I hope.